Some of you are at different places. Some of you may already know how to play chess. Some of you may not have any idea how to play chess. So we're going to start with just the basics so that you get a general understanding of how it's set up. So you're going to watch this video on how to set up your chessboard and what the different pieces look like.
Let's start with a basic introduction to chess to make it easier for you to understand the rest, or to simply refresh your memory. A chessboard consists of 64 square spaces. There are files, which are the columns going up and down, pointing at you and your opponent, and marked from A to H. And then there are ranks, the horizontal rows from 1 to 8. Each of the 64 spaces is identified by the combination of a letter of the file and a number of the rank. The player with the white pieces goes first. Each chess piece has a name and specific move capabilities. Don't forget to position the board correctly before playing. Each player should have a dark square in their lower left corner. Now, the first piece we're going to discuss is the rook. It's placed at the corners of the board, which are A1 and H1 for one player, and A8 and H8 for the other. The best thing about rooks is that they can move any number of vacant squares, both vertically and horizontally. If your opponent's piece blocks either of your paths, move the rook to the occupied square, and there you go. Another player's piece will be long gone. But remember one important thing. Rooks can't jump over pieces. That's checkers. If one of your pieces is between your rook and your opponent's piece, this move is not going to work. Next, we'll take a closer look at the horse or knight. Knights are placed on squares B1 and G1 for one player, and B8 and G8 for the other. Unlike rooks, knights can jump over other pieces, and they're actually the only piece that can do that. They move in an L-shaped pattern, 2 squares horizontally and 1 vertically, or 1 horizontally and 2 vertically. Keep in mind that knights can capture a piece only when they land on that piece's square. Next up, we have the bishops in square C1 and F1, or C8 and F8. Bishops can move over any number of free squares in a diagonal direction. Just like rooks, they can capture an opponent's piece standing in their way by stopping on that piece's square. But step aside, everyone. It's time for the king and queen to enter the game. Welcome, your royal highnesses. You only get one queen, D1 for a white queen, or D8 for a black queen, and she's the most important piece on the board, basically the rook and bishop combined. She can literally do whatever she wants, moving any number of vacant squares horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. She captures pieces on her way by moving to their squares. The king's place is one of the 2 last empty squares, E1 and E8. The king isn't as powerful as the queen and can only move 1 square at a time horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. He can attack any piece except for the other king and queen, and that's because he can't move close enough to initiate a capture. But don't underestimate him. The king is unbelievably valuable. If you lose him, you lose the game. So try to protect him at all costs. Finally, we have a whole row of pawns to shield your other pieces. They take the rows from A1 to H1 for one player, and from A7 to H7 for the other. Pawns move 1 square forward with one exception. The first time they move, pawns can go forward either 1 or 2 squares, but no more of that after the first move. Only 1 square at a time for the rest of the game. Now, there's one downside to pawns. If your opponent's piece is directly in front of your pawn, you can't move it forward or capture the piece. Talk about inconvenience, right? The only way for the pawn to capture the piece is when that piece is placed 1 square forward and another one to the left or right of the pawn itself. And there we have all the chess pieces. Okay, So to win and become a true chess champion, your task is to checkmate your opponent's king. It may sound like a piece of cake, but it's way more complicated than you might think. Checkmate basically means putting the king in a position where he'll be captured because he can't move or be protected by any other piece. The more of your opponent's pieces you capture, the easier it'll be to checkmate. Just don't focus all your energy on this. Your own king should be properly protected at all times so that your opponent can't get to him. Before you checkmate your opponent, you can just check them. This means that you should have one of your pieces within capturing range of your rival's king. In this situation, you must say check out loud to let your opponent avoid checkmate by moving their king to any free square, blocking the check by placing one of their pieces in front of the king to protect him, or capturing your piece that has placed their king in check. The same applies to you as well. If you're in danger of a check, you have the same three options to escape it. To avoid a check yourself, think carefully before making any move that might expose your king to capture. Only one rule applies here. Do not move your king onto a square that your opponent's piece might move to on their next move. But enough with all the theory. Let's talk strategies. Even though the game ends with checkmate, each of the pieces has its own relative offensive strength value. For pawns, it's 1 point. A knight's value is 3 points, 3.5 points for a bishop, 5 points for a rook, and 9 points for a queen. This is really helpful when comparing the total points value of each player to see who has the current advantage. The most important thing to know is the strong points of any piece. Pawns, for example, are stronger when they're together in chains to protect one another. Try to keep them that way unless you see an amazing opportunity to break the chain and make a great strategic move. Knights are weak and useless if you keep them near the edge of the board. Knights can control up to 8 squares, but when you put them near the edge, this number gets cut in half. Use their abilities to your advantage instead of limiting them. Bishops are at their strongest when they're on or near long diagonals. They can control more squares. Rooks have the most power in open files. Try to position your rooks on files that don't contain any of your pawns. Rooks can also be quite helpful on the 7th rank for white and the 2nd rank for black, but only if your opponent's king is on the starting rank. But what about the queens? They are dripping with power on any square, right? Well, the center of the board is actually the best place for them strategically, but the worst in terms of all the danger they're exposed to. Successful chess players suggest keeping the queen one move away from the center and trying not to block her movement with any of your own pieces. For the kings, there's only one strict rule. Do anything you can to make sure that your opponent doesn't get to him. If you want to make your own rules on the chessboard and be the main force of the game, try to control the center of the board. Your opening can help you do that.
So there was a lot in that video. So I want to kind of break it down and review with you more slowly what each of the pieces looks like and how they move. So first off, we're just going to learn the names of the pieces. And I'll tell you generally how they move, but then I'm going to demonstrate on a board how they would move. So here are all the chess pieces that you will see on a board. So there are 6 of them. And for most of them, there are multiple pieces, and for 2 of them, there's a single. So for instance, your king, which is the most important one, it typically has a crown on top of it, or like a cross on top of it like this. This is your most important piece, because if your opponent captures this, the game is over. So this is not like basketball or football, and the person with the highest score wins. I could have all of your pieces except for 2. And with those 2 pieces, you're able to capture my king, you win. So it doesn't matter how many pieces you capture, that certainly gives you an advantage. But what really matters is capturing this king. So this is the one you need to protect at all costs. The king really doesn't have much power in its movement. It can only move one space, but it can move diagonally, up, down. And so if you have the king on the board, it can move one space in the square that surrounds it. And so there's only one king that's on the board. The most powerful piece on the board is this, which is the queen. So the queen is the most powerful piece because it can move in the most directions. So it can move diagonally, it can move up, it can move down, it can move sideways. So it can move in just about any direction that any of the pieces can move in, with exception to the knight, which we'll talk about in a minute. So as long as there's no pieces in its way, it can move as far as the board will allow it to move. So should you choose to do that. So that's the queen. She's the most important piece. If you lose her, you don't lose the game necessarily, but you're definitely at a disadvantage to someone who has their queen. This piece right here is known as the rook. So typically it looks like a castle like you see here. It goes on the ends of the board in the back row. And this can only move in straight lines, either up the row or across the column. So, and only as far as the board allows. So what I mean by that is if there's a piece in its way, this cannot jump over any pieces. It can claim a space from an opponent's piece, but it cannot jump over that. It has to stop at that piece or stop before that piece or whatever. So oftentimes when you first start your chess match, this piece is trapped by your pawns, and we'll talk about what that looks like. So this is a rook. This is a bishop. So a bishop, on the other hand, can only move diagonally. Now it can move in any direction diagonally, but it only is going to move on. So in other words, if it starts on a dark square, it can only move diagonally on dark squares and kind of like a straight diagonal. So it can't like jag over or jump from one row to the other necessarily. So this is only going to be moving diagonally, and again, only as far as the board will allow it. It can't jump over pieces. And like I said, so one of your bishops will start on a light square and one will start on a dark square, and they stay on those squares the entire time. So you've made a mistake if you look down and two of your bishops are both on light squares. Somewhere you messed up, because one has to be on a light square and one has to be in a dark square. So that is your bishop. Probably the most confusing piece is this one right here, which is often called the horse, but is actually called the knight. And the reason why this is the most confusing is because it kind of moves in a weird shape. So it moves in an L. So it can, and it is the one piece out of all your pieces that can jump over another piece. Now, just because you jump over the piece does not mean you claim it. You actually have to land on the square in order to claim your opponent's piece. So jumping over, it's not like checkers where you jump over it and you claim that piece. Jumping over it doesn't do anything other than it frees up the piece. So this is either going to move 2 squares up and 1 over, or 1 up and 2 over, but it's always going to be 3 squares. So either a 2-1 combination or a 1-2 combination, but always in an L shape. So this is probably one of the most difficult pieces to use on the board effectively because of its weird movement. The last piece I'm going to talk about is the pawn. There are 8 of these pawns. And the pawns, with exception to the king, are probably the most, well, they're probably the weakest piece on the board because they can only move forward. There's no moving backwards of a pawn, only moving forward. And it can only move one space. The exception to this is if it is your first move, that you have not touched the pawn at all, you've never moved the pawn, and you're touching it for the first time, you can move it 2 spaces forward. But you don't have to. You can move it the 1 space or you can move the 2 space. You have the option. And like I said, it can only move up in a straight row. It can't move to the side. It can't move diagonals. It can only move up. The exception is if you are capturing your opponent's piece, you can only capture that at a diagonal, 1 space diagonal. So in other words, if your pawn is moving along and you come up against another pawn, you're stuck. You can't capture that unless there's another piece to the side of that you could attack diagonally. And I'll show you what that looks like on the board. But there are 8 of these, which are the pawn. There are 2 of these, which is the knight. There are 2 of these, which is the bishop. There are 2 of these on your board, which is the rook. There is 1 queen. Now, the exception to that, and I don't want to confuse you too much, but the exception to that is if you can take a pawn and move it from one end of the board to the complete other end of the board, you can promote it to a queen. So you could possibly have 2 queens on, or 3 or 4 queens on your board, depending on how many pawns that you promote. But just know that it starts with 1 queen. And then lastly, of course, is the king, the most important piece on the board, because it's the one you have to protect the most. So those are all the pieces. Moment to go back and review the pieces, but I want you to tell me what these pieces are. So what I'll do is I'll show a piece. I want you to raise your hand and then give the name of that piece. Okay? So here is our first piece. Hopefully by now you have guessed that that is the rook. Bonus points if someone can raise their hand and tell me how that piece can move. This piece can only move in straight lines, either up, down, or sideways, but only in a straight line. Can anyone tell me what this piece is? And no, it is not the horse. If you haven't guessed by now, this is the knight. And the knight moves in a very awkward way as compared to all the other pieces. Can anyone tell me what shape it makes when it moves? It makes an L shape. So it's either going to move 2 squares up and 1 over, or 1 up and 2 over in each of those directions, as long as there's nothing blocking its finishing space. You can land on an opponent's piece, and you can jump over opponent's piece. If you jump over opponent's piece, remember, that doesn't mean you capture it. You have to land on it. How about this one? So this is your most powerful piece on the board. This is the queen. And why is it so powerful? And what directions can it move? So a queen can move up, down, sideways, diagonally. Now, it can only move one of those, though. It can't like go sideways and then all of a sudden go diagonally. So when you're making one move, it's either got to be a straight line up or down or a straight line diagonally, but it cannot like change in mid move. Okay, so that's the queen and the most important piece. Not the most important piece, I'm sorry, the most powerful piece. The most important piece would be this one. Yes, that's the king. Can anyone tell me how the king, even though it's the most important piece, what is its only movement? A king can only move one space, either up, down, sideways, or diagonally, but no more than one space. Can anyone tell me what this piece is? This is the bishop, if you didn't guess bishop. In what direction? So far we've had the rook, which can move up and down, the knight, which can move in an L shape, the queen, which can move in generally any direction except for the L shape. So what direction is left that this one moves in? Yes, diagonally. This can only move diagonally. Our last piece we're going to talk about is the one you have the most of, but it is the weakest piece, and it's this one right here. This is the pawn. So the pawn is on the second row of your board, and it kind of protects all of your other pieces at the start of the chess match. But you also, in order to move your pieces that are behind this, with exception to the knight, you have to move your pawns out. So pawns can move in what direction? Only. They can only move up. Now, if it's the first time you're moving that piece, how many spaces are you able to move it if you choose to do it that way? It can move either 2 spaces or 1 space, but only on that first move and only straight up. When this piece is attacking, what is the only way it can attack? A pawn can only attack on a diagonal. So if it comes up against another piece, which is right in front of it, it's kind of stuck. It can't go anywhere. Unless there are pieces on the other side of that piece that it could attack diagonally. Then it could move that way. So those are the pieces again. So I showed you varying colors. There are generally 2 colors on a chessboard. And a majority of the time it is what I showed you here, which are white and black. But they're actually called dark and light. So the light color is the white in this case. The dark color is the black in this case. It's not always black and white. I have chess pieces that have like purple and yellow, that have red and blue. So there's all different types of colors you can have. But the light one is the one that moves first, and the dark one is the one that always moves second. So again, to show you those pieces, we got a pawn, we've got the knight, we've got a bishop, we've got the rook, we've got the queen, and then lastly, our most important part, which is the king. So I'm going to use this animated short to show you how these pieces move and kind of review with you how these pieces move. So this is how a chessboard is set up. So you have the light side and you have the dark side. So in this case, it's white is the light and silver is the dark. So you can see the pawn moving 2 spaces forward because it has the option to move 2 spaces forward. It could just move 1. This first move. There's the knight moving in the L shape. It can jump over pieces. There's another two space move by a pawn. There's a knight moving again in its L shape. Another L shape. So notice that bishop is moving only at a diagonal, and it's on the same color the entire time in a straight line. There's another knight. So they've kind of the piece that's been played more. And so what you see here is this person's down to 2 pieces. That's the king, which can only move 1 direction. And that's the king, which also can only move 1 direction. But this person, the dark side has more pieces than the light side, which means it's going to have an advantage. So remember, pawns can only attack from the diagonal. So that's the pawn beats, even though it's the weakest piece, it beat the king in this case because it trapped it and it could move diagonally. So that's just a kind of brief overview of how those pieces are in motion. The pieces you did not see were the rooks, which can move in straight lines. So the last thing I'm going to show you then is what a board looks like. So this is not flat like it normally would be. It's up, but you can get the general idea. So here we have our light pieces, and here we have our dark pieces. What you see on the second row of both are all these 8 pawns. So you see the 8 pawns here. And then the way you set it up is the queen always goes on her color. So the light queen is on a light square, and the dark queen should be on the dark square right here. So they're both on the color of their, so dark, dark, light, light. The king goes on the opposite side of that, and then it goes bishop, knight, and rook, always. So again, this first row is the pawns, and then this row is the rook, knight, bishop, queen on her color, king, and then it goes the opposite, bishop, knight, rook. Okay, so that's what it looks like on the board. So if I were moving this pawn, how many spaces could I move this? I could move this 1 space, or I could move it 2 spaces. By doing that now, I have freed up my piece that can actually start to move. But remember, then it's dark's turn. So the dark is going to move 2 spaces here. Now that this is freed up, I could move this queen at a diagonal on the same color, end up right here. And I know I'm safe because this pawn cannot attack me, because remember, pawns can only attack diagonally. If I were here, this pawn could attack me. But because I'm right in front of it, it cannot attack me. But now that I've moved this piece out, I'm going to move out my rook, which can only go in straight lines. So it's going to go straight until it hits a dead end. It's going to stop there. But now, on my next move, I could go all the way over here if I wanted to, or I could stop anywhere along this row where I wanted to. So then, again, I'm starting to move my pawns out because I want to clear up space. So I'm moving this pawn just 1 space. Here, I am going to move my rook on a straight line, and I'm going to stop right here. I can stop wherever I want to on that line to put it in position that I want. Now that I've cleared up this space, I can move out my bishop. Bishops, remember, are diagonally on its color. So it started on a light. It's got to continue on a light. It's going to stop right here. And so on and so forth. So there you see how pieces move on a chessboard. My suggestion is, I know that most of you have iPads or computers or things of that nature. There are free chess games that you can download as an app. And this is a great way to learn chess. And the reason why is these apps don't let you make what are called illegal moves. So in other words, if I took my rook and I tried to move it diagonally, that's an illegal move. I'm not allowed to do that. I can only move straight. Okay? So those chess apps don't allow you to do that. Because what I see with a lot of beginning chess players is they tend to make mistakes with illegal moves and no one catches that. So they're making illegal moves throughout their chess game. So that's what we want to cut down on. So that is how a chessboard generally works.